Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about globalization and the knowledge economy and the relationship of those two ideas to postgraduate education. And we're going to begin by thinking back to the last century. The last century was a time of economic production focused on factories producing multiple versions of the same thing. Think back to Henry Ford, who developed some of the first assembly lines in the world, producing the Model T Ford car, and his statement that you can have any color you like as long as it's black. So the factories produced multiple copies of the same car. Anyway, that mode of production, which is sometimes known as Fordism, after Henry Ford, dominated the 20th century. If you think about working on an assembly line in a factory, then essentially it requires low skills. You don't have to be highly educated because you're going to be doing the same job day after day for all of your working life. And in fact, as many commentators point out, social stability in an age of mass production and people working in factories was dependent on not having a highly educated populace. You didn't want people who were critical of the means of economic production. You wanted people who would just go to work, who wouldn't think about what they were doing, and would basically be satisfied with what they had. Now let's move forward to the 21st century, to where we are now. This century is very different, and production is focused not on mass production of the same kinds of goods, but on reinvention, literally on reinventing existing goods. And a good example of this is the cell phone. We all have cell phones, and most of us have contracts that provide us with a new cell phone every few years. As a contract comes to an end, we don't need a new cell phone. Often the old one will work perfectly well, but we get a new cell phone because there's a new model available. And the people in the cell phone companies, Samsung, Apple, they constantly develop new models of cell phones and market those models to consumers, and as a result, we get them. So that idea of reinventing a cell phone is what characterizes the mode of economic production in the 21st century. And of course, this involves what's called a knowledge economy, dependent on high skills. It's also, I'll come back to the idea of high skills in a minute, but it's also the era of globalization, involving the lowering of trade restrictions across national borders and the use of technology to facilitate communication in trade. So these things, high skills, what are they and why do we need them? Well, in the knowledge economy, high skills are needed, first of all, to reinvent, to reimagine existing goods, to put new features on a cell phone or a motor car, a refrigerator, whatever, to source the materials necessary to produce them across the globe. If you think of titanium, which is found on South African beaches, that's needed to produce cell phones. But the cell phones aren't manufactured in this country. The titanium itself is mined here, and then it's exported to another country where it's refined, and then the refined product goes into a factory to produce components. High skills are needed in this process to arrange for just-in-time delivery of raw materials and components between factories. And in fact, it's quite interesting that we've seen this process of just-in-time delivery interrupted because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some factories have shut down, and if a factory in one company has shut down, it can't produce the components which are needed elsewhere. So these supply chains have been interrupted. And the idea of just in time is important because the thinking is that you don't carry stock. You just get enough when you need it because it's cheaper to work like that. You need people with high skills who can market the reinvented products, people who can make us want that new cell phone or that new car. And we also need people with the skills who can distribute and sell the finished products across the globe. To get an iPhone from a factory in China to a shop in a small town in South Africa. What all this means, of course, is that the role of higher education as a producer of graduates with high skills has become increasingly important. In the last century, higher education wasn't so important because the majority of people were going to end up in jobs that needed low skills. If you need high skills, then going on to a university or a university of technology is going to be really, really important. So in response to this changed mode of economic production, higher education systems themselves have increased in size. And if you look at South Africa, our student numbers have doubled since 1994 to just over 1 million now. And we're late coming to this process of increasing the size of our higher education system. More developed countries started increasing the size of their systems from about the 1950s onwards, as this idea of high skills began to take root. But it's at postgraduate level that the new knowledge necessary for reinvention is produced. With that observation, just pause for a moment and think about your university. What's happened to postgraduate numbers there? Have they increased? What's happened? Dominant discourses, dominant sets of ideas, construct the answer to the need for an increased number of postgraduate students and more successful completions at postgraduate level in enhanced supervision. So the focus is very much turned to the supervisor. But is it possible for individual supervisors to make a difference in this way? Our experience of running the Strengthening Postgraduate Supervision course shows that it's the environment that's important as much as the individual supervisor. If the contexts in which supervisors and students work are research-rich, then experiences are more positive and you get better results. So what does a research-rich environment involve? Well, it's about lots of people doing and talking about research, in the tea room, in departmental meetings, wherever. It's about seminars and workshops being held to discuss approaches and findings, and about postgraduate students being invited to take part in this process. It's about material support for research. It's about funding. It's about computers. It's about having laboratories and other facilities necessary to do this work. All this makes a difference, but arguably the most important thing is the talking about and the sharing of research in the context in which supervisors and their students work. So pause again. Is the context in which you work research-rich? How could it be made more conducive for research? What else could happen to make it more research-rich? And finally, let's turn to the idea of knowledge itself in the globalized economy and this knowledge need for processes of reinvention. The global economy relies on the new knowledge needed for reinvention. This suggests that knowledge needs to be applied, to be useful in some way, economically useful. What does all this say for blue skies research? For research which doesn't have any economic use, which isn't applied, which is about knowledge for knowledge's sake? What does it say for research in the social sciences and the humanities? What about research for the sake of humanity itself? What about research for the sake of society? So think about where you work. If you're in the social sciences or the humanities, have you experienced the focus on the need for useful research, for research that will have an economic impact negatively? Or hasn't it affected you? But do think about the privileging of some kinds of knowledge in the so-called knowledge economy, and what the impact of this privilege might have on other areas.